First of all, I want to just say it's a delight to be here with you. And your charge keeps getting larger. I often say, when you have too much on your plate, the solution is to get a bigger plate. So you might want to get a bigger plate because I have more to put on. Your union, historically and now under Mary Kay's leadership, has a unique and important role, and I would say not just for workers, but for the world. And I mean that in all seriousness. We are in a very difficult situation in the United States and the world. If we don't get it right, then the whole earth is at risk. And I don't believe we can get it right without not unions, but SEIU playing a critical role. I don't want to put a lot of pressure on you. So your mission statement talks about social justice. So why social justice? Is there another kind of justice? And there is. There's individual justice. Just social justice means just that. It means justice in society. And while I agree with virtually everything Becky said, I want to suggest to you that the best way to actually change hearts and minds is actually to change institutions. We actually think it's the reverse, but years of research have shown that the best way to change hearts and minds are to change institutions. Now, the reality is you don't have to choose one or the other. You can do both. So how do we get to this point where many of us today think there's social justice over here and economic justice over here? There's a period of time we can go back and find when that detour happened in the United States. It's 1940s and 50s. Thank you. The height or beginning of the civil rights movement. And there was an African American, some of you may have heard of him. His name was W.B. Du Bois. And he was clear that you cannot achieve civil rights or social justice without economic justice. He was so clear, and he pushed that as one of the founders of the NAACP and as one of the architects of the modern human rights movement, and he insisted that you could not have human rights or civil rights without economic rights. He got in a fight with Eleanor Roosevelt, and the NAACP decided it was more important to have the vice president, to have the president's wife, than to have W.B. Du Bois. And besides, wasn't he a socialist anyway? So they ended up pushing him out of the NAACP, handcuffing him when he's almost 90 years old, and embarrassed him. And he went to Africa and died in Ghana, brokenhearted. But he understood that you simply could not have economic rights without civil rights, social justice, and human rights. There's a book on this called Eyes Off the Prize, to talk about this agreement we made to separate human rights and civil rights. I want to talk a little bit about race. As you already heard from Lynn, that we had a conference on othering and belonging. And we had the pleasure of having Andrew Solomon speak at our conference, and you're in for a treat tonight. I went to Ohio State from Minneapolis, and I created something called the Kerwin Institute. But it was too narrow because we worked on race and ethnicity. And I realized that really we're talking about not just race, not just ethnicity, but we're talking about gender, we're talking about religion, we're talking about disability, that we're talking about a process in which we dehumanize fellow humans. And then in the process of doing that, we dehumanize ourselves. And the process of dehumanizing people is not just a psychological, emotional space, it also is a structural and institutional space. When we talk about segregation, segregation is the very expression of saying some people don't belong. When we look at our immigration policy is a policy saying some people don't belong. When we look at our prison policies, mass incarceration is saying that some lives don't matter. We're one of the few industrial countries in the world where people can't vote while they're in prison. We're fighting to restore votes when people get out of prison. But if you're in Canada, that radical country north of us, while you're in prison, you still maintain the right to vote because they want to hold on to our humanity at all costs. And they realize that anything that would diminish our common humanity is a problem. There are only 2 states in the United States that allow people to vote while they're in prison. And just so happen those 2 states have only 2 black people in them. So a lot of this is about race. And race is not just what happens to black people. As Maya Angelou said, and Toni Morrison, we've been studying for years what effect does slavery have on the black psyche. She said it's about time people ask, what effect does it have on the white psyche? You cannot enslave a people without enslaving yourselves. Our whole system, not just who we are, but how we think about institutions and structures have all been affected by the way we approach the issue of slavery. So we're trying to reclaim social justice, economic justice, a society where we can be human. And I talk about the circle of human concern, where none are outside the circle. None, no human are outside the circle. And we could extend that circle of human concern, not just to humans, but to say respect for life and earth, and the earth itself. I want to tell you just 2 quick stories about myself, and then close, because I want to hear Andrew Solomon. When I was a young high school student, I have 5 sisters, 3 brothers, and I had this knack of processing information fast. So I could process information fast, which meant I was good at taking tests. So at 17, I got a scholarship to Harvard. And I said, I'm not going. My parents said, why not? My parents were sharecroppers from the South. They didn't know about education in schools very much, but they had heard of Harvard. And so they said, why aren't you going to go to Harvard? They're giving you a free ride. And I said, because they don't allow women in Harvard. And I was 17 years old, so I didn't have a fancy vocabulary to back it up, but I knew at a gut level that there was something wrong where you have one of the leading colleges in the university saying women are not allowed. And my parents said, if you don't go to Harvard, don't expect any help from us. Now, my parents were sharecroppers, so that was a hollow threat. They didn't have any help to give anyway, at least economically. So they were very upset that I went to Stanford instead of Harvard. And then years later, as my friends were getting married, one after another, someone said to me, so John, when are you going to get married? And I said, I would not get married in the United States as long as gays and lesbians cannot get married. Now, on one hand, I wasn't doing that for women and for gays and lesbians. I was doing it for me, because I would have to cut off part of my humanity to deny their humanity. Now, more recently, some of my friends have come to say, well, gays and lesbians can get married now, so what you going to do? That's another discussion. I want to leave you with this. What the elites have done is to create what is called the middle stratum. What's the middle stratum? The middle stratum is what we call white people. James Baldwin says, there's no hope for us as long as they think they're white. And what he's talking about, that there's this space called the middle stratum, which was created, and Becky talked about it some, where the elites created a break between, there weren't blacks and whites at the time, but they became blacks and whites. Whites became the middle stratum. Whites were not the elites. The elites were the elites. They were British. The middle stratum had a dual role. One role was allegiance to the elites. The other role was to police the people of color. That came wrapped up into white identity. White identity became that of identifying with the elites and policing non-whites. We need a different space so that people who think of themselves as white, and I don't mean how you look, I mean a ontological space in which we occupy. Because if you believe your role is to police the other, then you don't want to be socially connected to the other. So the problem with Social Security after Johnson was you linked white people and black people. The problem with integration after Brown was that black people and white people were linked. And the problem with the Affordable Care Act was, this, again, a social relationship between blacks and whites that's deeply embedded in the very identity of whites. And as the country is changing, the elites have figured out, here's another chance to use the anxiety around white identity, but it's not limited to whites, white identity to actually restructure the economy into something where the government works mainly for the elite and not for people. So how do we fix this? We fix this by creating a new space where we all belong and by reclaiming the government so that it works for people again. And the only way to do this is through organizing and concerted action, and that's where SEIU comes in. You have expressions of this in Minnesota, you have expressions of this in Colorado and other parts of the country, and it's a question of working beyond just unions in the narrow sense, but also working with faith-based groups, also working with community groups, and realizing this is not just an economic fight, this is not just a political fight, this is a profoundly moral and spiritual fight. And one reason that there was so much excitement when the Pope was here is he was telling us we are fighting for each other and for the planet itself. And we can only do that, we can only win that fight with SEIU at the leadership. And that's why I'm here tonight, and that's why I'm delighted to stand shoulder to shoulder with you and follow Becky and Mary Kay. Thank you.